Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Nazir, Daf Kafbet. This week's learning is sponsored by Ruth Rodenberg, commemorating our daughter, Taniel Gavriya Margalit's Yurtzeit. Hard to believe it is 18 years. You continue to live within us and inspire us and so many others. Thank you to Rabbanit Farber for your tireless and inspired teaching and leadership. Okay, we're going to go to our, we were back at a question. If you remember, we had two questions in yesterday's daf, besides two other small things, which was, the first question, if you remember, was when each person takes the neder and says va'ani, are they referring to the person before them, or are they referring to the original person who made the vow? Then we have another question, which is when a husband nullifies his wife's vow, is he nullifying it from the beginning? Does the nullification work all the way back to the beginning? Or is the nullification, is it megas gayas, does it end right here, only from that moment, but her neder from before actually was a neder for the whole time until he nullified it? There's all sorts of ramifications, right? For instance, we saw yesterday, what does she get lashes? If it was, she went against her nizirut, and then he wipes it out, if it erases from the beginning, she wouldn't get lashes. Doesn't, she does. So anyway, we tried to bring three sources. We were unsuccessful. I want to just remind you that we saw this already, and we discussed this, if you remember. We discussed this whole topic when we were doing hafarat nidarim and nidarim. Those last two chapters, when we talked about the difference between hatara and hafara, right? Hatara, everybody agrees that it's all the way back from the beginning, okay? That it undoes your neder from the beginning, because you're basically saying, I never would have taken this vow. When we talked about hafara, we said most commentaries differentiate and say, oh, hafara is only from here on in. But it wasn't really agreed upon from everyone. And really today's sugya is going to show you why there's a lack of clarity. Because sources 4 and sources 5 are each going to prove the opposite, okay? Which kind of leaves this sugya a little bit open-ended or very open-ended. Okay, so either you could say it's a machloket tanaim. There are some commentaries that try to reconcile the fact that source 4 is going to say this way and source 5 is going to say that way. But it really does look, as we say, al panav, on the surface anyway, it looks like there's a Tannaitic debate about it. And one braita says one way and one braita says the other. So that's where we're going to be left at the end of this section. Starting with Tashma, source number 4. So until now, the three sources we brought were unsuccessful. Tashma, Isha shenedra b'nazir v'nitmeh. This is actually a source we saw before. A woman, we saw it on Daf Yutet, a woman who takes a vow to be a Nazir and becomes impure. And then her husband nullifies the vow. And if you remember, what happened was 7 days passed and she already had separated animals to bring for the sacrifice for having become impure. And then the husband nullifies the vow. So what happens too? We're assuming she took the one set of birds, the two birds, one for the chata, one for the ola. And what does she do with them now? She brings the chatat, she doesn't bring the ola. So right now they're going to ignore the chatat and focus on the fact that she doesn't bring the ola. If we say that the husband cuts the vow only from here on in, so all the time before she was a nizira, she was obligated in the sacrifices when she became impure. She separated it already. So the fact that he cuts it off from now should be irrelevant. She should still bring the ola. The fact that she doesn't bring the ola proves megas guys. Okay, that's their proof. We could stop here. But the Gemara is going to ask the same question they asked the last time we saw this source, which was, Elamai, me'aker, what? You're going to say it, right? It really, and it's the reason why, sorry, I hope I said this right. The reason why she doesn't bring the ola off is not because it cuts it off from here, but because it obviously he erased it from the beginning. So now the Gemara says, okay, so Elamai, you want to say now, me'aker, he really erased it. It was as if she was never in Nazirah. Well, chatana of nami lo titi. In other words, why did you ignore the chatat? Well, it's true she doesn't bring the ola, and you can try to say maybe it's because he actually uprooted it from the very beginning, and it was as if she was never in Nazirah, and that's why she doesn't bring that korban. But what about the chatat? Why does she bring a korban chatat? To which the Gemara is going to answer, oh, hachinami, really, she shouldn't bring it. In terms of she was not Nizirah who became impure, okay? Because he erases it really from the beginning. So when he does the nullification, it's as if she was never ever a Nizirah. But Hamane, Rabbi Elazar Kapar. Remember, this braita goes like Rabbi Elazar Kapar, who held Tanya Rabbi Elazar Kapar Balebi Omer. Ma Talmud Lamal Me'asher Chatal Nefesh. Why does it say that the Nazir sinned? V'chi be'ezo nefesh chatal. What sin did the Nazir do? Just by virtue of the fact that they forbade themselves from drinking wine for X amount of time, that is already deserving of a sin offering. So while this woman was not actually a nizirah, because he really erased it from the beginning and whatever happened, it was as if it really never happened. But she's still a sinner because all those days that she was keeping the laws of being a nizirah, even though she wasn't really one in the end, but she was sinning because she shouldn't be doing that. That's not the Jewish way. So therefore, so we're just continuing Rabbi Elazar Kapar's words, which is that he wants to bring something else that we can learn from there, which is here's our kavachomer. The least, right, the more lenient case, or the more, I'd say the less, not as bad if all you do is just not drink wine and you're considered a sinner even though that's all you did. A more severe case, which is, let's say you don't drink wine and you don't eat meat and you don't eat cheese and you don't eat, you fast for a few days or for whatever it might be. All the more so are you considered a sinner. Again, that was a point that has nothing to do with our point. It was just Rabbi Elazar Kapar saying that we don't want people doing this kind of thing. You shouldn't preach asceticism. It's not what we do. It's not a value, a Torah value. So now going back, what did we do with this source? We brought this source that says basically the main point being she doesn't bring the Olat HaOf. Why does she bring the Olat HaOf, even though she was in Nizirah, became impure, and then only later did her husband nullify the vow before she brought the sacrifice? Well, it obviously then doesn't mean Megas Gaius, because if he cuts the neder from just then, and the neder still existed before, then she would have to bring the Ola also, because whatever she did, just like she would have gotten lashes, she would have had to bring the Korban Ola. The issue with the Chatat is a side thing, because it's like Rabbi Elazar Kapar that said she sinned. But that's why she brings the Chatat, but the Ola she doesn't have to bring, because obviously he basically erases her neder. It was as if she was never in the Zikah. That's that situation. By the way, this source seems to contradict something we saw at the end of yesterday's stuff, if you notice, which is what? There we saw the Chatat of a woman. Okay, we had a woman, Haishasha Nadra ben Nazir, on about 10 lines from the bottom. She drank wine and mitamal metim. No, not that case. Sorry, the one before that, about 15 lines from the bottom. Haishasha Nadra ben Nazir v'hiflisha et behemta. She designates her animal, and then hefer la ba'ala. Remember, and then he nullifies her vow. And what did we say? We said that the Chatat, if it was her own animal, the Chatat is left to die. And if it was his animal, the Chatat goes back to the flock. Notice what does appear here. It doesn't appear here that she brings a sin offering. So there's a little contradiction here. So either you say, right, Rabbi Elazar Kapar, maybe that doesn't hold like Rabbi Elazar Kapar. Some people say that it's a difference because there she was just a Nizirah and she didn't become impure to the dead. Here she did two things wrong because she was a Nizirah, she separated herself from all these things and then went against the law and did something wrong, right? She came into Malamaitim, and maybe because of that, she needs to bring a sacrifice. In any case, just point out that this source doesn't really seem to jive with the other one, which again, Tanaitic sources could contradict each other. It's not insane. And as I said, right now, we're going to see it inside. So source number 4, right? Source number 1, 2, 3 didn't prove anything about the answer to our question because each one could have been understood in different ways. Those we saw yesterday. Source 4 proves that it must be he uproots it from the beginning, and that's why she doesn't bring the Korban Ola. Next source, Hashma de Tanya Behedye. Here is the one where it's said explicitly, and you can see now why I told you, right, that when it comes to Afara, most commentaries actually say that it's Megas Gaius, and that's because of this clear-cut braita that says it explicitly, okay, which again contradicts the conclusion from the source we just read. Okay, we're going to bring, I just want to point out the structure of today's stuff. We're going to bring this source to basically give us an answer to our question, a very clear-cut answer that Megas Gaius, I'm already telling you. And then we're going to deal with this braita in a few different ways. Okay, the rest of the daf, for the most part, except for the very last section, is going to deal with understanding different things that can come out of this braita. So she becomes a Nizira. She becomes a Nizira. And then her friend says, and me. And then comes the husband of the first woman and nullifies her vow. So I was a Nizira. You said, I want to also be a Nizira like you, right? You just said the words and me, vani, one word, which translates in English into two. And then my husband nullified my vow. So what's your status? This will tell us exactly, me'aker aker or megas gais. If we say me'aker aker, he erased it from the beginning, then you never connected to anything because I was never in Nizira. You won't be in Nizira. If we say megas gais, it's only from here on in, then at 10 o'clock in the morning when I became a Nizira, and then 11 o'clock in the morning you said and me, and then at 12 o'clock, my husband nullified it. He only nullified it going forward from 12. But since you said it at 11, your neder's a neder. At 10, that existed. And even at 12, what I said at 10 existed, it just gets wiped out starting at 12. Just like if I had sinned at 11, I would have gotten lashes, even if he nullifies it at 12. Again, if you hold that way. So if she says, so you'll be permitted. I'll be permitted. I'm not a Nizira anymore, but you'll be forbidden because you latched onto something that did exist at that time. And even after he nullifies it, it still exists in history, right? In past time, it exists. It's just from here on in, I'm not a Nazir anymore. So if at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, after my husband nullified the vow, someone said, and me, obviously that would be irrelevant. I mean, forgetting about the whole Tok Pidei Dibur anyway, but theoretically, that's the concept here. So Shma Mina Ba'al Megas Gais. From here, it's explicitly clear that Megas Gais. So that's the braita that shows it explicitly, Megas Gais. As I said, the previous braita, you could really pretty clearly infer that me'aker aker, it's from the beginning. And that's why there's some lack of clarity about how we hold on this issue. Although most of the commentaries do side on Megas Gais, and that's one of the differences between hatara and hafara. Rabbi Shimon Omer, and here starts something interesting. And I want you to think about, it's not always so easy in these dapim to think about relevant issues, right? We're not generally Nazirim anymore. A lot of these things are all sorts of nuances. But today's nuances, I think, are very interesting. Let's read and then we'll talk about it. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Im amra la hareini kimotayich. We had ve'ani. I said I'm Nizira, and you said and me. And then what did we say? You obviously meant what I am originally. And if my status changes, yours doesn't. But if you said the words hareini kimotech, I want to be just like you, then shtehem mutarot. Then if my husband nullifies my vow and I'm no longer in Nizira, then you're not going to be as well. And I think that what's going on here is in understanding that there's different ways, and wait till we get to another question on this, where they try to find something what's in the middle of these two. Okay, there's a scale. Sometimes you see someone doing something amazing and you say, wow, that's really amazing what they're doing. I want to do that too. And you don't care if they end up doing it or not end up doing it. You saw it. You want to imitate it because it's a good thing to do. And you say, I'm going to do that also. And if they decide they're not continuing on that path, that's irrelevant to you. Because what they have done is they've inspired you, even though they are, okay, let's take doing the daf. Okay, you see a friend doing the daf, you say, wow, that's amazing. I'm going to do the daf just like you. And then 2 weeks later, your friend drops out of doing the daf. Now, are you going to drop out? No, because you were inspired by what she was doing. The fact that she didn't keep it up, okay, fine, she didn't keep it up. But you were inspired and want to keep it up. That's ani. If you say ani kamotech, then, okay, I'll give you the example of in my house on every Friday night, my youngest daughter wants to always wear the same dress that my older daughter, her older sister's wearing. And she finds dresses in her closet that match whatever, it has to go in some way. She wants to be just like her. And if, it becomes complicated because getting out of the house Friday night, we have to wait till one gets dressed till the other one can get dressed. And then if she changes her clothes, okay, imagine, right? Of course, the younger daughter is going to change her clothes as well, because all she wants is to be just like her. So whatever just like her might be, if just like her changes, then just like her is going to change as well. If she changes, it's going to change. So that is another concept of, so we have two issues going on here. One is, I'm inspired by you. I'm going to do what you're doing. I don't care if you're doing it either. The other is, and we're going to see this theme a bunch of times today, The other is, I'm doing it because you're doing it, and I want to be with you. So whatever happens to you is going to happen to me. So now, turning to Hama Bet. Now we're going to get a little sidetracked into something else. I'll already tell you that there's two different ways to read this entirely. I'm going to read it in one way. It's not to cause too much confusion. I'm going to read it in one way, but know that there's different ways to understand this. Zutra braita Rabbi Amar. So now we're going back to the beginning of that braita that we used to prove our point about nullifies. Again, just to remind you, if you said and me, then if the husband nullifies the vow, the first person is not a Nazir anymore, but the friend is still a Nazir. So comes Zutra. We basically have a situation. Let me just analyze it the way we're going to see it in a minute, where you said and me to something that could have changed, right? From right now was a sul in the beginning. I was a Nazir, I was forbidden, but I could potentially have changed to a different status, right? Because my husband could have nullified and therefore could be mutar. So was I referring to the beginning of what I said, or was I referring to the end game where I would end up, which is possibly not a Nazir at all? But we say it goes by the beginning. So Zutra says, you know what? This could be used to answer a question that Rami bar Hama asked that no one had an answer to. We can use this braita as a proof, as an answer. Why? First of all, it was his question, and you should know that we learned this in the beginning of Masechet Nedarim. To buy Rami bar Hama, and by the way, this is an example where the sugya here is understood a little bit differently than when they quote the sugya in Nedarim, but I'm not going to get into those details. I just want to point out methodologically, sometimes sugyot appear in different places and they're understood slightly differently. To buy Rami bar Hama, he asked the following question. First thing you need to know is what Basar Zevach Shlamim is. In a minute, we're going to talk about it. Basar Zevach Shlamim means the meat of a peace offering. What's the status of the meat of a peace offering? So first you slaughter the animal, then you collect the blood, you sprinkle it on the altar. Until that point, this is sanctified. I sanctified the animal, then I slaughtered it, or whoever did, right? And they sprinkled the blood on the altar. As soon as they sprinkle the blood on the altar, that's the main central part of the sacrifice. At that point, there's a few parts of it that get burnt on the altar, but the rest of the meat is permitted to me. That's a peace offering, as opposed to, let's say, a burnt offering where it all gets burnt, the korban ola, and it's called ola in Hebrew because it goes up. It all gets burned. The shlamim is a peace offering. I get to eat it. There's all sorts of korbanot that fall into that category that we eat the meat of the sacrifice. Then there's the ones in between, which is the kohanim eat the meat like an asham and a chatat, but not the owners. Not going to get into all that yet. In Zvachim, you'll have this all down pat eventually. So now, what happens? So again, you have something similar to our Nazira, where its status in the beginning is that it's forbidden. But over time, it will be permitted once you sprinkle the blood. So it's very similar. So if somebody says, if I say, this piece of bread is going to be like, this is what we call hatpasa. I connect it to something that's a davar hanador that I vowed, because I basically took this regular animal and I made it into a sacrifice. This is why we usually say nidarim or korban. So I said it's going to be like the meat of the zevach shlamim. But I didn't specify like it when it's permitted or like it when it's forbidden. When it's in original status before the blood gets sprinkled on the altar, or after. Now you have to ask a little bit, why on earth would you make a declaration? This loaf of bread is like meat once it's permitted to me. It would be a little strange, right? More likely you're talking about the forbidden element of it. But in any case, he asked this question, and it's not actually clear what the answer is. When the person connects it to some forbidden, to this basar shlamim, is he connecting it to it in its original status, which is forbidden? That's bi'ikar hamatpis. Or maybe he's talking about it in its cooled stage. What does cooled mean? Right? Something's hot and then it cools down. Something was forbidden and now it cooled off, meaning it's no longer forbidden. It's a little bit of a strange language that they're using here, but that's the idea. Does it mean once the blood was sprinkled and the meat is permitted? To which the Gemara says, midami. Are these really similar? Now, if it were me, I would have said something else. I would have said these cases aren't similar. Why? Well, the meat, you knew at the beginning that it was going to be permitted once you sprinkled the blood. The woman, when you said, I'm going to be like her, You didn't, right? When you said, I'm going to be in a Nazir like me, you said like me, you didn't know that my husband was going to nullify my vow. So while it was possible there was going to be a later stage of heter, it's not clear that you were referring to that and thinking about it at the time, because who knew my husband was going to nullify? So it's not exactly the same fair comparison. You could suggest, to knock out my question, that maybe it was very common that husbands would nullify vows of wives. And therefore, the question is really, when you say, I want to be like you, knowing that there was a high percentage, a good chance that my Nazirut would be nullified, because you knew I was a woman and you knew my husband could theoretically nullify it. Were you thinking about, I want to be a Nazirah? By the way, you could say that when you said, I want this loaf to be like the meat, what you were saying is, I want it to be like the meat in its stage now, but when the meat becomes permitted, I want to be able to eat this loaf of bread also, right? That you wanted to have the changing status. You wanted to have, and maybe that's what it means when it says Ikar matpis or Bitsnana matpis, maybe that's why it's referring to cooling off, that as it changes the meat, also the loaf is going to change. So you're basically forbidding something temporarily. So it could be the woman saying the same thing. I want to be a Nazirah temporarily. If you remain to a Nazirah, then I'll remain a Nazirah. But if you change your status, I want to change. So what we're saying is, since the braita says basically that if my status changes, yours doesn't when you say Bani, then we can use this to answer the question about the Basar Shlamim. You must be referring to its original status and not as it changes. Okay? That's what he wants to suggest. But now the Gemara says, Midami, these things aren't comparable. Not for the reason I said, but for a different reason. Since he said, it's going to be to me like Basar Zevach HaShlamim, Zevach HaShlamim is different than a Nazirah. Why? Even though after the blood is sprinkled, you can eat it outside the temple, Mikdash Kaddish, it still retains some of its original sanctity. It's not like you've taken off everything. Why? It has certain rules. It has to be within a certain time frame. You have 2 days and a night. If you don't eat it within that time frame, it has to be burnt on the altar. You can't eat it anymore. And if you eat it, you get karet. Second, if you have to eat it within the walls of Jerusalem, you can't just eat it anywhere. So it has all sorts of sanctity on it still. So if you connect this loaf of bread to that meat, you really could be referring to whatever happens to it, because it still retains some element of sanctity. So you can't necessarily learn that it's going to be the same as the woman. Okay, it's not the same comparison, because the Nazirah, if you're going to say it's Bitsnana Kamatpis, that maybe it's referring to as it's cooling off, but Hefer Labala, there's nothing left anymore. So maybe it's more obvious in that case, since it goes from 100 to 0, that you clearly weren't referring to 0, you wanted to keep something, and therefore it goes back to the beginning. But in a case where it cools down and it's went from 100 to 20, let's say, maybe you meant to keep it at that 20 status, or maybe you meant to keep it at, maybe you meant to change as it changes, and it now becomes permitted in the way, like maybe that loaf of bread, you want it to eat it in Jerusalem, you want, right, whatever's left of it, that's what you want to maintain. So it's not really a fair comparison. So again, what did we try to do? We tried to use our braita. Zutra said this could answer Rami bar Hama's question, because it's very similar. It's connecting your vow to a vow that has changing status. But we say the change in status is very different, because one goes to 0 and one goes to, let's say, 20%. To which the Gemara then tells us, some people say, Rami bar Hama v'adai. This is exactly Rami bar Hama, and it proves that we get an answer to his question, and they don't start to say these aren't really similar. So we have 2 ways of reading this. Again, like I said, there's 2 ways of reading this whole sugya, and I'm not going to get into that, but reading it in this way, the Gemara itself brings 2 possibilities. Either Zutra tries to use it to prove the braita, to prove Rami bar Hama get an answer to his question, and the Gemara rejects that. But the second version says, no, he actually got to an answer to Rami bar Hama's question, and that works. Now I want to go back to this braita and this topic I talked about before, and about this scale of what you mean when you say, I want to be like you. So the braita had set up 2 scenarios. One is ve'ani, okay? Which means, right, I'm like you, and we said that means in the original state. It doesn't matter what happens to you. Then we said, Hareini kimotech. Shmuel said it, but it seems like, not Shmuel, Rabbi Shimon said it, but it seems like no one disagreed with him. He was really just clarifying Tanakama. He pointed out that if you say, I want to be just like you, then that means whatever change of status happens. Comes the Gemara and asks, what about something in the middle? Hareini bi'ikvayich. I'm going to, I skipped a few words. Amrala, hareini nizira bi'ikvayich ma. If I say, I'm going to be a nizira in your footsteps. Some people actually have a different version. It says bi'ikarayich. If you're in your original state, which does sound more like original state, which would be weird, but we're going to basically, whether you say that or that, some people say, why bi'ikvayich? Ikvayich means in your footsteps. Some people say in your footsteps refers more back to the beginning. And some people think in your footsteps maybe refers to the end. So again, it's however we understand this, it's some case that falls in between on the scale and me and between I want to be just like you. It's something in the middle. I want to walk in your footsteps. What footsteps does it mean? The original footsteps or the final footsteps? Where you ended up. To which, and I'm going to put it out there that the next section, the Gemara, and the way they get the answer to this question is a little bit complicated, but let's just read the question first. Does it mean I'm going in your footsteps for whatever your whole track is, I'm going to be following you. And then she'll be permitted when the husband nullifies my vow, then you'll be permitted because you said I'm going in your footsteps. Or maybe you're saying, I'm going in your footsteps based on what you did right now, because I'm impressed with what you did. I want to do it. I'm inspired. I want to do it myself. And then they'll be forbidden. Tashma. So now there's a little bit of a problem with this Gemara. You would have expected if they're going to bring a source, that says bi'ikvayich, right? They're going to find somewhere where it says it. It's not what they're going to do. They're going to bring a case where someone said, and me, which is a little bit weird how they're proving from and me. They're going to basically, and it's hard to read this sugya, I'm already telling you, it's basically taking a case where someone says, and me, and they're going to say that is the same as bi'ikvayich in your footsteps, which is a little bit weird because we were trying to find out this interesting language of bi'ikvayich. How do we get it from Vani? So we'll try to explain it in some way, but I'm already telling you that the question is better than the answer. Tashma. Now, the case we talked about before was a friend. The friend says Vani, it's clearly from the beginning. The friend says, I want to be like you. It's clearly whatever track you take. What about bi'ikvayich? To prove it, they're going to take a husband who says ve'ani. Okay, so she says, I'm a nizira, and he says, and me, eno yachol lahafil. Now, the assumption here is the ve'ani of the husband is like the ikvayich of a woman. Why is that? So Tosafot raises this question. It says very clearly there's a problem here because how did you get from ani to bi'ikvayich? Why are you using that to prove? So what he suggests is, and I'll take it with my understanding of Tosafot because I'm telling you I don't 100% fully understand, but the way I understand it is like this. Because we put it on a scale, right? We have ve'ani, bi'ikvayich, and then hareini kimotech. We have me. We have on the other end of the scale, I'm just like you. And we have in the middle, I'm going in your footsteps. With a husband, ve'ani would be more in the middle. And then it would be like bi'ikvayich. Why is that? When you say, and I'm going to be just like you have no control over what's going to happen to me going forward because you can't nullify my vow. So when you say ve'ani, you must be meaning whatever status I'm in right now. But when a husband says ve'ani, so claims Tosafot, because it's, and this is what Tosafot says, and then my interpretation is like it's on the scale. I think what he's saying is it's on the scale in the middle there. When a husband says ve'ani, because he knows that it's in his control to nullify her vow, his ve'ani is a weaker ve'ani than someone else. And it could be he's referring to, I'm going to be with you, whatever track you take, because I am in control of your track and I know that it can change because I can change it. So maybe he really meant as you change, okay? So because of that, they put the husband's ve'ani like the bi'ikvayich. So a husband saying ve'ani is equal to a woman saying to another woman bi'ikvayich. Or it could be a man, it could be anyone saying, right? But the more obvious case would be another woman says. So assuming that, okay, that's an assumption you have to take, because if you don't take that assumption, there's no way to read this sugya. whether you take Tosafot's explanation or there are some others that are, again, not the most convincing, but somehow the Gemara views the ve'ani as the husband as the same as be'ikvayach of the woman. So with that, we're going to read this sugya. So now, if you remember, we had two reasons why the husband can't be made for the neder. And we're going to go through those two reasons again in the same order we went through them last time. So here goes. And if you didn't remember, now we'll go through it again. It'll be good review. Okay, now they're substituting the words. Va'ani is the same as hareni be'ikvayach. If he were to say hareni be'ikvayach, and we'd say be'ikara kamakpis, he's going back to the beginning, and basically, which means if her status changes, his won't. Well, leifer la ledida v'lo kim dide. Then he should be able to nullify her vow, and his will stand. Because remember, what was the whole reason why he couldn't nullify the vow? Because the concern was if he nullifies the vow, his will be nullified as well. So what do you see here? Be'ikvayach of the husband must mean, right, or the va'ani of the husband, which is like be'ikvayach of the friend, is whatever track you take. Because that's the whole reason we don't let him nullify the vow, is because in the end, if he nullifies her vow, his vow will be nullified. And if his vow is nullified, what's the problem? He ends up being matir. He nullifies his own vow, which he can't do. You can't undo your own vow. So that must be the reason. And therefore, it must be that when he says vani, he's basically saying, I'm going to be with you whatever happens to you, which is why he can't nullify her vow at that point. And therefore, anyone who says bikvotayich must be saying, I'm going in your footsteps, whatever path you take. Now, but remember, yes, we did reject this reason. So that's what we're going to say right now. This was an attempt to try to learn from our Mishna the answer to this question about be'ikvayach. And therefore the Gemara says, right, I'm going to repeat that last line. From here, one can infer, assuming you go with this explanation of the Mishnah, Bikula milta makpis, he meant whatever which way she goes. The hilka hudala matze mefer. And that's why he can't nullify it. And from there, one would conclude, ha'isha da'amra hareini be'ikvayach, hi nami muteret. So if a woman says, I'm going in your footsteps, which is equivalent to this case of the man saying, and me, right? However we accept that, then she's permitted because she goes with her the whole way. To which the Gemara rejects, as we rejected this interpretation when we had it last time, and said, lo olam bi'ikara makpis. No, you could say the husband is really going back to the beginning and saying, you're a Nazirah, I'm a Nazir too. No matter what happens to you, I'm going to remain a Nazir. And the reason he can't nullify the neder is not because of what we just said, that it'll undo his, because it won't undo his. He can actually theoretically nullify her vow without it affecting his vow, which means it's bikar, and it doesn't prove anything about this woman, right? Or it would prove that it's bikar, that her status wouldn't change. The whole reason why he can't nullify her vow is because he already ratified it. When she says, I'm a Nazirah, and he says, and me, he's saying, oh, I approve of what you did. And I'm also going to be a Nazir as well. And because he approves, this, by the way, adds another element, that when you do something like someone else, you're basically saying, I approve of what you're doing, right? It's a method of approval, saying, I really like what you're doing. I'm going to do it also, which means I'm very happy you did this. So that is already ratifying the vow. And then what are the laws if he ratifies the vow? Remember, if he undoes, he can go to a chacham and say, listen, I didn't really mean to ratify your vow. Then he can nullify it, but lo. But if not. And that's why the Mishna said he can't nullify it, because unless he does hat she'ela on his ratification, he can't nullify her vow. So now what we showed is the Mishna could go both ways. We don't really know the reasoning of the Mishna. It could be the first way we read it, could be the second way, which means that we can't learn anything from here about if I go in your footsteps. In the end, it's not a good proof because, again, number one, it's not a great proof because he didn't actually use the words in your footsteps. So that, putting aside the whole difficulty with this sugya, which is we're comparing a case of va'ani to be'ikvayach, that's a whole question in and of itself, which again, we saw Tosafot's resolution, which is a possible way to go, but it's definitely a difficulty with the sugya. But in the end, the sugya says, since the Mishnah can be understood in two totally different ways, whereas maybe he really is going like whatever her track is, or maybe he's not, and maybe he's going by the original. So therefore, we're left with no answer to the question. Last sugya for today, which is going to go again back to this issue of, first of all, this is another practical issue. This happened to me actually last week. My daughter sent me a WhatsApp said something that seemed totally absurd. And I wrote back to her, I said, what on earth are you talking about? And then she just hadn't put punctuation and the sentence came out meaning something totally the opposite, and basically it was very unclear what she meant. Had she just put a comma in, I would have understood what she meant. So here we're going to have one of those punctuation sugyas. Hareini Nazir ve'at. If you remember our Mishna, we're now quoting the line of Mishna. He says, I'm going to be a Nazir, the husband. And then he looks at his wife and says, what about you? Ve'amra amen. And she said, I'll be a Nazir with you too. Mefer et shela v'shelo kayam. He can undo hers without affecting his. Makes a lot of sense because hers wasn't dependent on his, right? He just said, I'm going to be a Nazir, and what about you? However, this contradicts another sugya. Why? It says, Hareini Nazir va'at, which sounds like, right? I'll be a Nazir, and what about you? Ve'amra amen, same exact case, and she said amen. Shnehem asurim. They're both Nazirim, okay? Because he took on Nazirut, and she accepted as well. Ve'im lav, but if she doesn't say amen, Shnehem mutarim. They're both permitted. He said, are you a Nazir? He said, I'm a Nazir, and what about you? And she says, no, I don't want to be a Nazir. Well, guess what? Neither of them are Nazirim, according to this braita. He depended his vow on hers. Now notice they're not exactly talking about the same thing because our Mishnah was talking about what about hafara? How does hafara affect it? But our Mishnah clearly said hers is not dependent. His is not dependent on hers because if hers disappears, his is still there. In this case, when it comes to taking on the neder, forget about hafara. You don't even take on the neder unless she agrees because he meant we're doing this together. And this is why I said, again, it's a matter of what did you mean? You're going on a diet, right? And you go on a diet with a friend. You say, I want to go on a diet. Will you join me? Now, if your friend doesn't join you, does that mean you're not going on it? Are you saying I'm only going if you go, right? We'll both do it together or not, right? That's part of the complication here. How do we understand this? So Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Peter says, don't worry. The braita is not contradicting because the braita wasn't talking about, right? The braita was talking about whether he takes it on or not takes it on. But once he takes it on, he says, add the words at the end of that braita, in the event that they both took it on, then if he nullifies her part, his remains. Okay, so when it comes to taking it on, yes, they both have to do it together. But once they do it together and it's on, his is no longer dependent on hers. When it comes to taking it on, though, maybe he will only take it on if she does. But in the end, if he gets rid of hers, it doesn't affect his. And then there's no real contradiction. But Abaye's is the more interesting answer. Abaye says, and with this we'll finish today's class, Abaye amal, afilu tema kedikatani. Even if you say it really does mean that one is dependent, right? The braita says his is dependent on hers. Our Mishna is saying his is not dependent on hers. They don't contradict. Why? Here's where we get to the punctuation. Braita kegon da amrla hareini nazir va'at. Tekatali nidro b'nidra. The Mishnah is not a question. It doesn't read, I'm a Nazir, and what about you? The Mishnah is saying where he says, I am a Nazir and you, meaning we're going to do this together. And if she agrees, then they do it together. If she doesn't agree, then they don't do it at all. Because he was saying, like I said with the diet, I'm only going to do it if you do it. Okay? It's not, I'm a Nazir, period. And what about you? The way we read our Mishnah. It's, I'm a Nazir and you. It's almost like a declaration. I'm taking upon Nazirut and you will too. And now he can't force her, but that's the whole thing. Either she agrees and then they're both Nazirim. She says, oh yeah, I'm with you. Let's go. Let's do it together. Or she says, no, I'm not interested. And then, okay, she's not a Nazir. He's not a Nazir because he depended his whole, whether I'm going to be a Nazir or not on her. I'm going to continue a drop into tomorrow's daf, and we'll finish up to the next Mishnah, the next two lines. Umatnitin, but the Mishnah is Kigon da'amrla hareini Nazir. He says, I'm a Nazir, period. And then ve'at, my, and what about you? Okay, and there it's a question. And then mishum hachi meferet shalav shelo kayam. There he accepted Nazirut. And then said, and do you also want to be a Nazirah? But that was independent of his. So again, I see you writing in the chat here. Doesn't as soon as he says the words Hareini Nazir is a Nazir, it depends how he says it. If he says Hareini Nazir va'at, let's do it together. That's what it means. she has to agree because there's two of them. And he's only doing it if they do it together. He's not willing to be a Nazir by himself. That's clear from his words. Again, that's the way Abaye reads it. So Abaye is saying that's what that braita is talking about. And then the braita and the Mishna are talking about two totally different cases. Okay. Yes. And it would be interesting. I agree that he basically, right. I don't know if what you're writing is what, but not determine the two. But basically what's interesting about this is he's saying we're going to do it together. And then ultimately he knocks out her vow. Although the truth is the braita didn't talk about him being Mefer her neder at all. Right. Basically what we're saying, the braita is really talking about the acceptance of Nizirut in general. And if he says it in a way that I'm only going to be a Nazir if you go with me and hold my hand, then it's only going to work if she agrees. If she doesn't agree, they're not. So here again, you see, again, like I said, it's hard to imagine this husband and wife going off and being Nazirim together. On the other hand, you can understand it in our life in terms of when you say, let's go do something together, how serious are you about the together? And if you're not going to have a partner, does that mean you didn't really mean to do it in the first place? Or you want someone to help you, but, and go with you, but it's not necessarily dependent on whether they join you or not. You're not going to not do it just because they don't do it with you. And this is all kinds of, you could call it peer pressure. You could call it wanting to be with other people, wanting to be like others, imitation. This is something that's a totally natural phenomenon that people want to do things in pairs. People want to have a partner with them. People want to copy other people that they respect. And then again, what happens when the person who chose it decides not to what extent did you want to just copy them? Or to what extent did you really, it was just a way to spur you into action, into doing something that they're doing. So we saw this in a bunch of different sugyot. Just to quickly summarize the top, we started with the fourth and fifth source, right? Fourth and fifth, that came to, I was thinking 1 and 2 on our page, but they each said megas gayas or me'akar akar. We had two sides in the end. We proved from different braitas different things. Then once we quoted this braita, that was the braita that we wanted, we went off on a tangent on that braita. First thing we have was Zutra, who tried to use the first part of the braita to prove, to get an answer to Rami bar Hama's question about the kibasar zevach shtarim. Then we took the second part of the braita, or really the fact that there's two different cases in the braita on different ends of the scale, and we talked about what about an in-between case? Hareini b'ikvayach, in your footsteps. What would that mean? And we tried to bring our Mishna to prove it. But since our Mishna could or could not be relating to that issue, we didn't really know. In the end, we couldn't prove it from there because the Mishna could be explained in two different ways. And then we brought this later part of the Mishna about the Hareini Nazir Va'at. We brought a contradiction to it and we resolved it in two different manners. Either by saying they don't actually contradict, and the braita would actually agree with the Mishna about the particular thing the Mishna was talking about. They were really just talking about two different things. Or we say, really, the braita is a different case entirely. It's the whole statement was different. Not that the issues they were discussing were different, but the whole statement was different. It really depends how it was punctuated and how it was intended. With that, we'll finish today's stuff, starting with the new Mishna tomorrow. Have a great day.